the Sherlock Holmes series of games from Frogwares, the original timeline. Frogwares' Sherlock Holmes series has a very special place in my heart. Uh, when I got the computer I had prior to the one I'm using when I make this recording, I actually had my late wife, had gotten me the fourth game for it, and then I hunted down the others. In fact, by the time we, quote, moved out on our own, I had five entries, and it looked like six, seven, and eight were not necessarily going to work on the computer I had at the time. But the series did captivate my mind, especially when your third entry, which I had to look up because of something that was in the fourth entry, was Sherlock Holmes versus Lovecraftian era stuff. Lovecraftian deities. And of course, I found out the fifth game was Sherlock Holmes versus hunting down famous serial killer Jack the Ripper. So, yeah, that all grabbed me from that point on. Sadly, I couldn't, continue playing the series until after my wife passed. Rest her soul. But I've also had a love for Sherlock Holmes because of my father. Now, these games were all made by Frogwares, but prior to the ninth entry, which is Chapter 1, which is a soft reboot, all these games were published by a different company. Frogwares made them, but they were published by other companies. Adventure Company, in some cases. I can't remember some of the others. And another thing about Sherlock Holmes stories is you don't necessarily get a year with some of these stories, but they all tend to be around the 1880s, 1890s, and some even a little bit later. And until the third game, you don't really get a placement of where they could occur in the timeline. Now, their release order is contrary to when the chronological order, and I played them in the chronological. I thought that was the better way to go in this case. Which means you saw me when I was playing through them, jumping from uh, middle of the time of the game release orders to well to the last one of that timeline. And each game introduced new mechanics for the most part, and slowly, eases into what we can now see in the games in the newer timeline, the reboot timeline. Now, the first one that was released, which is the seventh in the timeline, it definitely shows its age. And it was probably good for its time. I never got to play through it because my first time playing through it, I think the game crashed. I couldn't start it up again. It only had 6 save slots. And you did have some seriously flawed timed events. Pardon. But like Sherlock Holmes, you would have to solve things to progress. The story is relatively straightforward. There's no real deduction on the crime, although you can figure things out as you find stuff, and you must do certain things in order to progress. That's the rules of the game. It's free on Steam. However, you do have to do some finagling to get it to work properly on a newer system. Do it if you want the frustration. But it's seventh in the timeline. Now, the second game had you do a little more deduction to figure some things out. However, there were some mechanics that were more based on the default size of the screen at the time. But there were also puzzles to figure out that you could use your mind to figure out and deduce everything, which was good. And you could find clues and, piece together certain things. I mean, using a walkthrough, I can get through the main part of the game and answer most of the optional questions afterwards. The game is set up to take place over 5 days, where you are completing certain tasks by certain times. Well, you can't advance the days until you complete certain tasks. But there is simple deduction thrown in there using classic Sherlock Holmes ideas and the stories. I mean, how do you prove that you were somewhere else? You get someone who has bad eyesight, you get partnered with someone with bad eyesight, and change how you look. And you have an inside man to help you get in there, which would explain such an odd seating arrangement that is mentioned in the game. The third one in the timeline, of course, is the Lovecraftian one. And this is also the one that sort of cements it, where a majority of stories take place in this timeline when you compare it to the original Sherlock Holmes lore. This one had some, quote, chase sequences, some timed events, so to speak, ingenious use of items, and some puzzle solving, with an overall, quote, case going on. The fourth game, which is Nemesis, had him go against the England's greatest detective against France's greatest gentleman thief. To which we have a lot of. I think this is by far one of the better things that they could have pulled off. Of course, like I said, in the fourth game there is a nod to the third game. I don't think there's a nod to the second game in the third game, but maybe in the fourth game there's a nod to it. But that's also complicates the timeline. But we won't go on about that one. In the fourth game, but that one's more localized in England, and also a lot more deduction and solving of puzzles to figure out the next step. The fifth one, I think, really starts showing a deduction tree or figuring out the timeline of events as well, which has never been a feature. It also includes creating a reenactment, so to speak, of crime scenes, and has Sherlock Holmes going after one of the most well known threats of the time, Jack the Ripper. And they do use some very key points from the cases, although I cannot say that the ending is lines up with reality. Now, the sixth game, well, we definitely have touchbacks to previous games in that. But we do have some things that we must figure out. But it does tie things in with the third game, played a bit in media res, so to speak, with puzzles to figure out, deductions, and sometimes your choices will have an effect on things. And some things can be done in certain orders. By the end of the game, however, you will have a quote face off, and probably one of the most beautiful signs of respect between adversaries. The seventh game does show more of our mind palace, which sort of stems with the previous games and allows you to start piecing things together from what you know, allowing you to make moral decisions as well as figure out a crime hopefully correctly. It's the first one in which you also have minor cases to solve that tie in with a bigger case. And two of those cases actually are adapted from actual Sherlock Holmes stories, which now shows that this series of games does use some of those, but not, directly. And now you must make moral decisions which could match the outcome of the actual stories or differ from them in a way. Every choice you make comes with a moral implication. It's also, I think this is the first one in which Mycroft shows up in person. And if you know the franchise, if you know the Sherlock Holmes franchise, you know that's a rare sight indeed. Man, so steadfast in his ways, but also brokers so much and can. It's, Sherlock says that Mycroft is definitely smarter than him. And Sherlock also is known to disregard information if he doesn't find it pertinent to his interests. He sort of compartmentalizes his mind. You also are allowed to, I guess they had like a master server because of Steam and all that for these games. And you could compare how you reacted to a majority of people out there, which is kind of nice, a neat little thing. Now, the eighth game released is the last one, in its timeline. But it also uses the same Mind Palace components that was in the seventh game. Has fewer cases, but it did expand your thought process so you could then piece together how something played out, more so than in the seventh game. It even had some events that you had to try and figure out and sort out too. I mean, you could figure out how something played out, you could figure out how a case plays out, you can affect the story in certain ways, but it has an overall theme to its stories and the end game. Now, each game is good, pardon, but each game has some sort of flaw in it that becomes a little bit more obvious. Like in the first game of the timeline, which is the fifth one released, the Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper. And this is the only one you could solidly set before that by a timeline. Because one puzzle was indeed set to work with the screen size. Because while you're trying to figure out the location to go to, you're comparing it to a map with clues and information that you have to section out the area. So, needless to say, when you're trying to draw a compass circle on the map, you're working with how the screen looks. It took me, and this is one of the few times I cut a video before doing it, and then, trying to remember where everything was to get it right. It took me about 90 some minutes just to get the right location. And that's because it was looking for it on the screen and, comparing everything and all that to what it has. But in that particular first game of the timeline, fifth released, Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper, Sherlock is on the case of finding the infamous killer. And in fact, you don't run into some people who are key to even the actual events as well as suspects until somewhat later in the game. There are some funny moments on it where you have to distract a mm, uh, rather I don't know how to describe her. She's a lady of the evening, loosely. She shows up in a couple of the games, believe it or not, if you know where to look. But a lot of characters they use some character models over. Yeah, you have to get her out of the way because to or cause a commotion with her to distract the police. So what does Holmes do? He gets the kids together. I was like, get as many cats as you can, and we unleash the kitties on her. But as it goes, the speculation and all that. What they come to in the conclusion, and even one, um, as Sherlock goes in pursuit of Jack the Ripper, as they go to location, trying to deduce things. Why are these people being targeted? What's going on? Who's at, who is actually Jack the Ripper? What can we figure out? Sherlock actually comes across one of the crime scenes, and he is visibly shook. In fact, as he, quote, tries to recreate it from memory, disturbs Watson, and, Holmes uses a little gallows humor. Uh, I mean, it's probably one way you have to shake something like that. But the investigation, you're figuring out the blade they're using. How is it that this man could have done all this in such short a time with such expert precision? And you're piecing everything together. And where everybody is getting concerned and all that. Now, your deductions lead you to the killer, who is part of the Jewish community. They are never having an easy time, the Jewish. And so Sherlock, once he figures out who the killer is, and basically, in a somewhat reenactment without much said, gets told sort of by the killer himself what's been done. Sherlock lets the Jewish community handle it as they could see fit. And as he puts it, if I go to the police with this, it's going and with how widespread and how big these murders have gotten, it's going to be bad for the Jewish community. No lie about that. It is going to be bad for the Jewish community. So, what Sherlock is going to do is he is going to basically put in there, let them handle it. The identity will remain unknown, but the killer will have, quote, vanished. Because, like I said, if it gets out that the killer is a Jewish man, and you get a few where some people have been gone after a suspect, and the uproar. So imagine what happens to a whole community of people who have basically always been targeted. Even as Holmes says to Watson, you're not going to be able to tell anyone about this. Make up something. Make up something about a ghost dog. And that's basically your first game of the timeline. Now, the second game of the timeline, that's the seventh game released. Wait. Nope. No, 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 no. It's not the seventh game released. What am I thinking? Uh, that wasn't the second game released. It was, second one of. Hmm? Okay, so. Oh, yeah, the next one in the timeline is The Awakened. which is the third game released. And it starts out with investigations into missing people, but then the discovery of some unique components, which leads Sherlock to a strange hidden temple in London devoted to Cthulhu. And more clues point to going to a location, to an asylum in Switzerland, where and this is also the one that sort of sets where a majority of these games from this point on take place after, at least story wise, in the Sherlock Holmes canon. Because while he finds this old mystic hidden in the depths, and find that they are trying to get people of all. See, it's found out that the mastermind of this plan is trying to give the world to Cthulhu. But in order to do it, a representative of each nation on Earth must willingly give up that nation to Cthulhu. So, of course, this guy, a surgeon that's part of this cult, is working to get them to say it. Of course, as Sherlock Holmes is studying all this location stuff, he finds he literally finds his adversary, James Moriarty. James does not fully recognize him yet until he finally gets out of the asylum, and of course will get his wits back with him. This is why Sherlock sets him free and convinces him that the man pursuing Sherlock is actually Sherlock. And to be honest, I don't think Sherlock likes seeing his adversary stuck in a place like that. But the investigation takes us from England to Switzerland to America, finding a place for the cult in America, Louisiana area, which plays with some of the stories that Lovecraft wrote. And then once you get out of there and you head back, of course, things are corrupt in Louisiana. But then once you get through all that, you move back, get to England, you locate where everything is going to happen at a lighthouse. And you have to get to the lighthouse, get to the top of the lighthouse, and defeat, well, foil the plan. Of course, this is another story that Holmes doesn't necessarily see the light, and of course it plagues Watson later on. Now, the next in the timeline is Sherlock Holmes Crimes and Punishments, which is technically the seventh game released. And this is those smaller cases which tie together in some ways, as we have a story of Mycroft asking Holmes to stop some anarchists called the Minutemen. I think that's what the name they used. But, he's solving cases in the cross, making moral decisions, like making decisions to condone or a killer, defend them because they did act in sort of a self defense. They weren't really doing it for money, or they made the murder look like a robbery gone wrong. And so, Sherlock is basically solving these cases, working to, you know, reveal the truth, and then decide if the truth should be made known or not. A good game overall. I loved it myself. I loved the majority of these games. Of course, in the end, he exposes the plan, destroys the plan. Your moral choices is if you turn them in or not. Because that's part of what it is. I mean, it's in the name, crimes and punishments. Does the punishment fit the crime? That's what you have to really ask yourself every time. We then move to the fourth of that timeline, which is Sherlock Holmes versus Arsène Lupin. And this one is, like I said, this was when I was introduced, where Sherlock Holmes is facing off against Arsène Lupin. Lupin tells Sherlock that he's going to commit 5 crimes. He's going to steal 5 things, and to show that France is greater than England. And so we are working through this one, trying to either head off Arsène or get ahead of him and stop him. And he leaves clues for his next crime at each crime location. I mean, his first crime is to steal a particular painting from the British Museum. Well, the British Art Museum. The second is the theft of the ravens from the Tower of London. There's an old legend that says if the ravens leave the tower, the kingdom will fall. I learned about that one when I went to England back in the 90s. The 1990s. Who knows how long this will be up on. The third crime is stealing the Rosetta Stone from the British Museum. The fourth crime is the only thing Lupin will not return when he gets caught at the end. He steals a kiss from Queen Victoria. And of course, his final theft will be that of the crown jewels. Not that anyone thinks he'd go after him again. except Holmes. This one's actually one, and there's some nice little nods in there for other things that he refers to. You got Corporal Wayne, who had a photography set, and if you take a picture of the one animal used to replace a raven, it's a bat. You can figure that one out why, and when you play the game or if you watch my playthrough. Uh, it also leads to people doing some rather questionable things to further the investigation or move things along. Of course, once Holmes reaches the end, catches up with Lupin and stops him from escaping with the jewels, they have a talk. Arson is allowed to leave, all items intact, and of course, the kiss cannot be returned. Holmes and Lupin agree that this is a stalemate. Arson is impressed and also pleased that Holmes figured out all his clues. Little bummed that he got stopped at the end. But in this case, if their little victory, if to admit that you got caught here, I would have to admit that you got away with the other stuff. Yes, true. Which looks bad on us. And your end capture would look bad on France. Yes. Not all of us come out of this shining. No, no, we don't. So agree to a stalemate, and we never say word of this again. Agreed. In fact, the fifth game has a bottle of champagne sent to Holmes from Lupin, under one of Lupin's aliases. There's always something in these that would prevent the story necessarily being told. I've always liked that. Now, of course, after that particular adventure, we have the second game released, which is the case of the Silver Earring in the timeline. Set over the course of 5 days, a weekend, to solve a crime and to, quote, exonerate the one suspect, which is the victim's daughter. And probably one of the biggest mistakes that this criminal made was that when they set up the plans to have it done, Holmes was part of the crowd. But Holmes was quick to investigate and was also even start piecing things together. Why does a man? Why would you go invite a man who had bad eyesight? Obviously, as part of your alibi. But you have to deduce clues and then get past some rather tricky sequences where you have to avoid dogs and a watchman. And again, this is one that's tricky because of how the screen is set up. I had a hard time with it when I first played it on my previous computer. The case is, of course, figured out that a man pretending to be a little bit higher up in the military and wants wealth. Well, he disguised himself. He plans to marry the victim's daughter to get the funds from the victim. Yeah, no, nothing like toying with a young girl's heart. Scum of the earth. But we figure things out. Really figure things out because of the location involved and finding some time sequences where you have to get from one section to another in a relatively quick amount of time. It's tricky, but in the end, you figure out that the earring is also a part of a set that unlocks a mysterious treasure, which reveals everything about all the details of the crime or the motives for the crime. Of course, in the end, Sherlock does reveal everything. But it's tricky, especially when you have some design flaws. But for a second game release, it's actually pretty good. Of course, after that, then we move to the sixth in the timeline. We get to the Testament of Sherlock Holmes, which is the sixth game released, and it ties in nicely to events in three. Well, actually, it ties in with a lot of events in prior games. You'll run into a lady that you helped in the fifth game, which was the first game in the original timeline. To which something is going on. Add to it that there is a journalist that is besmirching Holmes's name. In fact, he's trying to get one judge in on it, but something also is the judge is noticing some discrepancies in the guy's claims. Of course, the problem is now some of your own decisions will make people wonder. And it actually opens with you solving a case of a stolen necklace. And you also find out that somebody who was part of the case was actually, one of the investigating officers, as you discover, was actually in on this plan. You see, there is a plan in the works to set an overthrow in action. And as you work your way through it, you find out that there's somebody who wants to make this very potent poison, and you find an expert poisoner who's been in jail, help him escape, or help facilitate his escape. Holmes's actions even comes into question, and he apparently appears to die. But it turns out that this whole thing, everything that's happening, and everybody blaming Holmes, is actually a complex plan of Moriarty to take over England, setting a proxy of his in place by setting soup kitchens to feed this poison to the people in Whitechapel to make them go mad and then go after everything, causing the people to, all police and that, to rush to Whitechapel, leaving the Queen unguarded, and of course taking her out and taking her place. It's a very complex plan. It's almost beautifully executed until Holmes fakes his death, comes to the aid, revealing also the location of four bombs set up to cause problems too. Four bombs, key locations, and all the people in Whitechapel going quite mad because of this poison. Yeah, it would be the perfect setup. Of course, in the end, you end up facing Moriarty. And when it comes down to you or him, what ends up happening is that the poisoner, now a victim of his own poison, has gone mad. He basically lunges and literally bites Moriarty's jugular before that doctor is killed, or that poisoner was killed. And Professor Moriarty is like, Holmes, you're the only one I know who can raise them. You find out that Moriarty was a father. And in probably one of the few signs of genuine respect you would get, and maybe there was a bit of planning in his part, I don't know. Moriarty basically wills Sherlock Holmes his daughter to raise. Of course, it'd be also a very clever way to hopefully take Sherlock Holmes out of the investigating game. Give him something that he has to protect. But it's beautifully added. It also shows a great deal of respect that Moriarty might have had for Holmes, because Holmes is the only one that was his mental equal, if not even superior. Then the next in the timeline is the mystery of the mummy, the very first case, that very first game that was released, where Holmes is asked to investigate a mansion belonging to a cousin of his or something like that, of of an apparent Egyptologist. It's divided into 5 sections. With someone walking around dressed as a mummy. And as you play through it, there are no saints in this one. It also gives Holmes in the stereotypical deerstalker and hunting jacket look that I think Basil Rathbone popularized to a degree. Honestly, he never didn't overly dress like that in the stories. This was definitely a product of its time, and while it is free on Steam, I recommend it if you can figure out how to get your controls to work proper on it. I had to deal with mirror controls and the mouse sometimes stopping halfway through the screen. So I had a hard time with it. But it has some puzzles in it that are very nicely put in. And I'm glad they kept some of those types of puzzles in these games. But others are just. They had a nonogram puzzle in that one, where you don't have sections divided out by, 5, 10, 15, 20, or any counts. So you have to figure things out. Ugh, it's horrible. my opinion. I mean, it was probably good for 2002, but for 2023, it's a pain in the arse. And then we move to the last of the time of this timeline, which is Sherlock Holmes' The Devil's Daughter. Four cases and a final over in the and an overall case, in which we do see Sherlock Holmes dealing with the trials of being a father, trying to protect a child, which means not necessarily telling them the truth when they might not be ready for it yet. And what brings it about is, of course, that there is a new neighbor who is turns out to be a daughter of another person Sherlock Holmes put away. But no doubt she's doing things to poison Caitlin's mind and exposes the truth to Caitlin, that Caitlin is the daughter of Professor James Moriarty, the Napoleon of crime in England. But every case in The Devil's Daughter, you will find the theme to it of parent protecting child, trying to do right by their child, and some of those cases were doozies and trials in and of themselves. These are all very good games. I'd recommend definitely replaying some of them. Uh, Looking for help when it comes to others. I mean, I'm going to put it this way: The Awakened has replay value. The original Awakened, the remastered Awakened, and of course, once I get to it in the due timeline, that'll probably have replay value too. Sherlock Holmes versus Arsene Lupin or Sherlock Holmes Nemesis, another beautiful game, definitely has replay value. Jack the Ripper, make sure you have somebody helping, to deal with that frustrating map thing. Cases, Silver Earring, again, you're going to have to deal with the graphics and the limitations of the programming at the time. If you could look past that, you're good. The Testament of Sherlock, definitely great replay value. Cases, Crimes and Punishments, The Devil's Daughter, both great replay value on those. Hardly any problem. Hell, play them for of the last three. Well, definitely the last of anyone that as you play as Toby. That's a plus. That's a plus. Then Testament, Crimes and Punishments. I think even the Devil's Daughter do have Toby segments in them. Mystery of the Mummy, I would recommend, if you have to play them all, tackle it with a way to counteract its limitations. And there are things that will help you with that. This is also why I think it's free on Steam, because of those limitations and they couldn't get things to work right. But definitely do play the games. If you play these before you would play Sherlock Holmes Chapter 1 or the remake of The Awakened for the new timeline, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine too. I believe Testament, Crimes and Punishments, Devil's Daughter are available on some newer systems like the Switch. But all the older ones you would probably have to go to Steam or GOG for. But they're all worth the play. They're, with the possible exception of Mystery of the Mummy, they're all worth the play. I love this series. I have a fondness for Sherlock Holmes. I mean, I've read Hound of the Baskervilles. I've listened to majority of the audio books from Magpie Audio multiple times. Sherlock Holmes is a part of our culture. These games really do tribute to Holmes very well. And I definitely recommend playing these games. They're some of the best out there. And that's all I'm going to say about the Sherlock Holmes series. Like I said, I reviewed them all individually here in my retrospectives. So this timeline is separate. This is a separate thing. Definitely play these games if you love Sherlock Holmes. You get the experience. The current games, they also give you the experience, but you need to see where they started to where to what they've become. And again, that's all I'm going to say about the original Sherlock Holmes timeline. I thank you for listening if you've listened this far and to the end, and please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Bye all.